welcome to the PacTrans seminar for leadership development. I think you all agree with me that leadership skills are so important, but very rarely you get this kind of education in your engineering curriculum. So it's our great pleasure to have Bob Skinner came from DC to deliver this seminar. And Mr. Skinner received his bachelor's degree in civil engineering from University of Virginia and a master's degree from MIT. He was TRB's executive director from 1994 to 2015. So that's really a long time. And we all witnessed TRB's great growth during his leadership. He was vice president of a consulting firm before joining TRB, and Bob also received a lot of awards. So certainly he's a very distinguished leader, and we are so glad to have him to talk to you about takeaways from the transportation engineering career. So if you are CET 599 students, please make sure you sign up there. There's a sign-up sheet. So with that, I will give the floor to Bob. Let's welcome Bob.
Okay, I'm a little hoarse. Can you all hear me okay? If you can't hear me, wave. Okay, well, thanks Yanhai for that introduction. The plan today is about some, I said, takeaways, lessons, things that I wish I knew when I started my career. And so this may be a little different than the normal seminar lecture. I'm not describing a research project. It may be a little disjointed, but nonetheless, we're gonna go from there. I'm going to use some examples from highway safety to make a few points as we go along. Let me first say a little bit more about my own background, which Yanhai summarized for you. After I went to what was the Transportation Systems Division within civil engineering at MIT. So it was very much a planning-oriented program. And right after that, I went into consulting. And I was a consultant for 12 years before I went to TRB. And I went to TRB at a time where it was just beginning to do what are called, they now call consensus studies. These are expert committees that are given a subject, usually that involves a question of science and technology, and relates somehow to transportation policy. And the committee is not an advisory committee. They are to produce a report. And we provided the staff support. In general, the TRB staff wrote all the words under the direction of the committees. And you'll find in committees like that, it's a lot easier to tell the staff that they've screwed up than it is to tell another member of the committee that they screwed up. So I did that, and then I did that for a couple years, and then I managed that group for a number of years before becoming the TRB executive director. So with that, let me get started. Now here's one. This is my first lesson, and this is obvious. It should be obvious, I think. I know if I had my 22-year-old self here, he would say, oh, I know these things. Transportation is a huge big deal. But sometimes knowing it and really thinking about the implications of it are two different things. Transportation is not a system, it's a system of systems. It's an enterprise that constitutes about 10% of the gross domestic product. Most of us who work in this field are working in a blend of the physical sciences and engineering and the behavioral and the social sciences. And so if that weren't enough, it's decentralized. It's a public-private enterprise. The federal government probably has as many levers to pull as anyone, but their role is limited. largely as a regulator, a funder. The only thing they really operate of great significance is the air traffic control system. So what does that mean? Well, one of the things it means is that in that kind of system, introducing new technology is complicated. There are a lot of barriers. Many of you are working on products that you could imagine would be operated on the highway system at some point. There are tens of thousands of governmental units, mostly local towns, cities, and counties that own the highway system. The states own the bulk of the high-level highways, but it's the cities and towns and counties that own the bulk of the system. A lot of folks. And of course, transportation is highly interconnected with people. Well, that seems obvious. Well, one of the differences is that with transportation, we're not just users of the system, we're all operators of the system. And we all have opinions about the system formed in part because of that role that we play as operators, as drivers of automobiles, trucks, scooters, bicycles, and the like. And human factors play an important role at the individual level. There's never been a time when we've had more uncertainty about the future of transportation, and a large part of that is related to the uncertainty of how people are going to behave when the vehicle takes over more and more of the driving function. Are they going to be attentive enough to step in when they need to step in to avoid a crash? And of course, the aggregated behavior of individuals amount to the travel choices and the travel demands and our capacity needs in our roadway system. But one of the things that's about people is that people change. Their behavior does change. Who knows what the highway capacity manual is? Oh, okay, all right, okay. So in a nutshell, the highway capacity manual is an empirically based manual that relates the geometric design features to the capacity of those features. You know, what's the throughput at a given level of service? And that manual has been produced and updated periodically since 1950. And if you go back at look at that manual, you'll discover that the capacity of, say, a lane on a freeway has increased steadily over that time. Well, why is that? It had nothing to do with engineering. In fact, the engineers wouldn't have imagined you could get that capacity out. But it's because of the willingness of drivers to go faster and faster with narrower and narrower gaps between them. And we count on that now. That's what, you know, we estimate our nation's highway needs and performance based on that empirical observation of human behavior. Early in my career, I did some travel demand modeling and forecasting. So I'm not a modeler, and I haven't touched models in a long time. I've been a consumer of models and model results and forecasts for quite a while. One of the things that I learned the hard way is that before you build a model, you need to understand what it is you're modeling qualitatively before you jump into the numbers. I was what I would call part of the second generation of travel demand forecasters. Do we have anybody that does travel demand forecasting here? Good, so I can speak with impunity. So the first generation developed relatively simple models. They're still in use today. And before they developed those models, because they were the path breakers, they had to understand the system very well before they built the models. When my generation came along, we saw all the deficiencies of those models. Oh, they're not policy sensitive, or they're not this, they're not that. The mathematics are not complicated enough. We have better mathematical tools. And we focused on the structures of the models before we learned and really understood the phenomenon that we were modeling oftentimes. And so first, again, it seems obvious, but understand what you're modeling first. understand what the expected uses are and what the input sources are. Again, doesn't that sound obvious? Well, the early models in travel forecasting, which are derisively referred to as the predict and provide from the sort of the late 1960s and the 1970s, well, they may have been better suited for the purposes to which they were being used, the questions that were being asked, than today's models are. And in part, I'm not knocking today's models, it's just that the questions are so much more complicated. Life then was, travel demand was heavily shaped by the work trip. Work trips were not chained together with other trips the way they are today. So it was, and we ask more fine-grained questions today, policy questions about what'll happen and what's not. So understand what they're going to be used for. Inputs, I worked on a set of forecasts for a light rail line. It was like the transportation system. No one was really responsible for the forecast because one group did the socioeconomic forecast, the MPO did. One group, the state, did certain of the models. We did the mode choice model, and results came out. And subsequently, time showed that we grossly overestimated the ridership on this light rail line. Well, why was that? Well, it's because the population and employment and downtown parking, all those forecasts were done as a sort of a quasi-political process in the MPO. It was all wishful thinking about what the development would be like, and it greatly distorted the results. Models, they all have errors built into them. Sometimes people confuse doing sensitivity analyses related to with the inputs with what the errors are in the model, but those are not the same thing. And so understanding and being willing to acknowledge and explain the limitations of your validation process and the errors is important. I sometimes say that anytime someone says they're going to optimize, they're going to come up with the optimal solution, I get a shooting pain down my right leg because almost always they've made simplifying assumptions or they've ignored things that are important but are qualitative. They can't get it all in the model, and then they glibly talk about the optimal solution. And then the last one, behavioral and natural phenomena. Again, it seems surprising that some people would confuse modeling physical behavior, modeling natural phenomena, and modeling behavioral phenomena. But one stays relatively constant over time, and the other one doesn't necessarily do so. Here's a couple highway safety examples from that. Okay, this is a lot of information on here, but what I'm focused on mainly is the death rate, which is deaths per 100 million vehicle miles over time. And that's the blue curve here, the blue line, not curve, blue line. And long about right in here, someone, and I don't know who, fit an exponential curve here with the approach to an asymptote, probably the constant term in that equation. And at the time, there was a federal highway administrator who was actually a former professor who had worked in, he was actually a former civil engineering professor, but he had worked in materials. And he saw that, and he explained to someone that it was not possible for this death rate to ever drop below a certain point because it was approaching an asymptote, and as we know, it'll never reach the asymptote. And then within about 5 years, it dropped below that asymptote because it's just a fitted curve to a behavioral phenomenon. There's actually another example, and this is something called Smedes Law. I'm guessing that no one has heard of Smedes Law. I didn't hear about it till after I had been working in the field for a long time. It's a British law, so that's probably why. But Smedes was a mathematician with a doctorate in aerospace engineering who spent World War II leading a unit that was trying to increase the efficiency of bombing over Germany, and included, I don't know if any of you know Freeman Dyson, who's a physicist, a famous writer. Freeman Dyson was in that same unit. And after the war, Smedes turned his talents to traffic and traffic flow, and he developed Smedes Law, which relates deaths to the number of registered vehicles in the population. And so, and this was treated as a law, and in fact, Freeman Dyson, who unfortunately just passed away about 2 weeks ago, he wrote a piece explaining that they had somehow tapped into a behavioral phenomenon. You know, it's sort of like risk compensation, if you know what that is. And so, but in the U.S., we went through a steady time when the number of vehicles per person went up, and deaths per person went down. So it has some problems, and I think it's just the main problem is letting physicists jump into behavioral phenomena. Okay. This next lesson is kind of closer to an area where I spent a lot of my time at TRB. This is it concerns policy, and the main lesson is that policy is embedded in so much of what we do. It may seem kind of obvious, but there are policies and policy choices and trade-offs that are embedded in regulations and standards and specifications. They deal with technical, economic, safety, and environment. They're almost certainly embedded in software that's being developed. Lots of time in past, it's often been left to expert committees. You know, the geometric design standards that I first looked at when I went to TRB were largely put together by expert committees, making the trade-offs between cost and roadway geometry, or the trade-offs between environmental degradation and safety. They were making those judgments themselves. And trade-offs, I think, are kind of what policy is all about. It's where, you know, there are two things that we're trading off, and usually we need a political or a quasi-political process to ensure that both sides are represented. And now we think of policy as something that's amenable to analysis, and many times you can get degrees in policy analysis, and most of them have to do with what I think of as a policy analysis is drawing the boundary line about what it is, what's the boundary of this question, what are the options that we need to consider, what are the impacts and the trade-offs that are out there. But at the end of the day, unless the evidence is really compelling, it may be that it's a political decision to resolve. I thought maybe just to kind of illustrate just a bit about what I'm thinking of here, I'd say a few words about school bus safety. Now, I don't know if any of you noticed on the news, but just a week or two ago, someone, I think it was the National Transportation Safety Board, released a video from a school bus crash that occurred in December. And this was a case where it was a large school bus. The large yellow school buses do not require seatbelts. So the kids were not seatbelted in. A car or some small, fairly lightweight vehicle hit the school bus, but it was enough to cause the driver to drive it into a ditch or whatever. In any case, it turned over. There was a camera inside the the bus. So it was a pretty scary looking video because you're seeing kids flying around. And fortunately, no one was seriously hurt. But when I saw this on the media, it was, oh, why don't they have seatbelts on school buses? Of course they should have seatbelts on school buses. And then when I was putting this paper together, I remembered that, and I Googled it, and it turns out if you want to see a real expose on this topic, the Today Show ran one in the last couple weeks. And so I don't know whether seatbelts on school buses are really warranted, but I have looked at this question in the past, and part of the question is to think about, well, what are the data? Okay, now this is school-age fatalities in school transportation crashes or incidents. Okay, so it's only the school-age kids. So it would be 281 over a 10-year period, 28.1 per year. It does not, it includes all buses used for official school transportation. So there's mostly the large yellow school buses, but there are some smaller buses included in this, and the smaller buses do require seatbelts. And this is not it's fatalities only, it's not serious injuries. And so if we were really doing an analysis of this, we wouldn't just be concerned about fatalities, but we would be concerned about injuries. So there's a lot of caveats here. But these are essentially the numbers that were used in this report on the Today Show, where they had a more recent 10-year period. So this number was slightly lower, but in essence what they were saying is 281 people have been killed in 10 years. School kids have been killed in these kind of accidents. We need seatbelts. Okay, that's what they said in essence. Well, of that 28.1, 5.8 were the occupants of school buses. These are the only ones that seatbelts on school buses would help. The occupants of other vehicles, that is, almost twice as many were kids that were riding in other cars that had a collision with a school bus. Pedestrians, 9.8. These are mostly kids that have been hit just before or just after, they're just before they board or just after. And of those, 6 are hit by a school bus. So just as many kids are hit by a school bus as pedestrians as are killed inside. And so, again, there are reasons why that I haven't mentioned why seatbelts still might be warranted on school buses. I'm not trying to take a stand on that, but I am trying to make this that, we don't need another half-baked analysis. If I had another lesson, it would probably be related to the media, because this is the number that they cited, but this is the number that really counted. Oh, and one of the things, because I hadn't revisited these statistics in a long time, this problem here, the 9.8, that was much worse years ago. And if you look at this picture, which is from my neighborhood, this stop signal arm has been added to reduce vehicles coming through. This thing here is called the crossing control arm. That's been added in many places. What that does is keeps kids from walking so close to the bumper that the driver can't see them. And then the last thing, which shows that I'm living in a place that's reasonably affluent, is this is a boarding assistant who's riding in the school bus and gets off to oversee the boarding and alighting process. Now, they only use these for kindergarten, so these kids are just going to kindergarten. Okay. Now, switching to a wildly different subject. History. Hardly anyone in this room knows what happened at the 75th anniversary of the Transportation Research Board. The 100th anniversary is going on now. But at the 75th, which I know most of you don't remember, David McCullough, who's a noted historian, spoke at the chairman's luncheon. And his line, which stuck with me, is know your stories. Know your stories. And his point was that, look, history is not just political history. It's not just military history. Everybody has got a history. And all your fields have histories to them. He had, at the time he did this, he had just written his biography of Truman, was working on a biography of John Adams. But the reason we asked him was because of two earlier books, which I highly commend, one on the building of the Brooklyn Bridge and one on the Panama Canal. Terrific books. And so here's a guy who was a historian but appreciated infrastructure. And I admit that, I'm I wouldn't say a history buff, but I read a lot of history. And so you might think, well, he just likes history. But that's not what I am saying now. I'm saying it's in your self-interest to understand the history of those that preceded you, the who, what, where, and why of the events that shaped what you're doing today. And I talked with one of the professors I talked with today, who's a structures person, and I said, how can you teach plastic design and steel design without explaining why plastic design why was it ever needed? Why did it come about? And so we do a lousy job with history, generally. We do a lousy job of teaching it everywhere except, I'm sure, the University of Washington. But, history, you don't have to go back in time. I mean, you could be in a field where your history is only 10 years old or 7 years old. But doesn't it make a real difference if you know what people were thinking when they first got started? Why are you working on what you're working on now and the like? So, again, I urge you to do that. I think you may find it fun, but self-interest. You'll just be a better engineer. Now, this one is another one I think is it's easier to say than to do. And first, let me say it's pretty humbling for anyone to be talking about speaking skills in public. You all get a chance to rate how well I've done at learning. First and foremost, everybody can improve. Everyone can improve. And some of you are operating in an environment where the language is not your first language. And so that's a double challenge, an immense challenge. But even if you're operating within your native language, developing communication skills is really important. And typically, engineering has not done a good job of teaching communication skills. In terms of oral communication, you're going to be doing it in a variety of settings. We don't have to be great orators. We're not doing presidential debates. For many of us, it may be it's mainly important how we can speak during small conferences or workshops. But one tip I have is that getting comfortable doesn't mean you're necessarily getting good. Okay, I'll assure you, I am perfectly comfortable up here. I can keep talking. In fact, if I talk over, it'll be because I'm so damn comfortable. But that doesn't mean that I'm good. all of us have to overcome those initial jitters associated with public speaking. But when you overcome those, you're not done. You still have more to do. If you want to try something, again, that's humbling for you, look at a videotape of yourself speaking. And it's painful. I know it was painful for me. With written, there are two books recently that I read. They're both bestsellers. Both are these stories of people who overcame tough conditions in their youth to go ahead and get education and go on to advanced degrees. One is called Educated by Tara Westover. And this is a test to see how broad-minded this engineering group is. Has anyone read Educated? Okay, I was on the bestseller list. Okay, has anyone read Hillbilly Elegy? It's another bestseller. The author of Hillbilly Elegy went on to get his law degree from Yale, and Tara Westover managed, with no education hardly at all, except obviously when she was bright, managed to get accepted to BYU based on homeschooling, which she really didn't have, and she got a PhD from Cambridge University. Well, I'm going out of my way to make the point that in both cases, as I was reading this, I was struck by how they had both become good students quickly, and they wrote well enough to satisfy the vast majority of their professors. So both of them were shocked when, in one case, a Cambridge professor, and in another case, a law professor at Yale, sat down with them and explained that their papers were not written well. It took that long. I mean, I had this conversation earlier today. I don't remember once when I was in college anyone correcting any sentence that I'd ever written. And that, and that builds a sort of false sense of confidence. I suggest, let's not this. Take a look at style guides for writing. Shrunk in White, it's been around since 1920s, multiple editions. I found it on the web, but it's certainly for sale. The Congressional Budget Office has a great one. It is on the website. It's particularly good for policy-oriented work, with federal programs and the like, but it has the same style stuff that's very helpful in toning up your writing. And again, as I say, everybody can improve. I'm actually speeding through this, so this won't be too painful. It's not going to go on forever. I wanted to say a word about career building, and we all only get one shot through this. We only get one chance to go through a career. Some of us change the career or alter the career during the course of time, but basically we get one chance to start on that path. And one piece of advice is to go out of your way to learn the landscape, what I'm calling the landscape, the institutional environment in which you're working. Back to that transportation, think how complicated the transportation picture that I explained earlier is. Well, one of the outcomes of that, or one of the results of that, or one of the characteristics is that there's lots of employers out there, lots that you didn't even think of. There are investment firms that hire people who are experts in infrastructure. And we could go on and on. There's, with all the work, I had no idea, and I'm still learning about the kinds of opportunities there are out there, and you don't find those opportunities unless you go looking for them. I know some people that have had a notion of what they wanted to be right from their, almost when they were in the crib, it seems, and they've stuck to it. But I don't think that's the way it is for most of us. Yes, we have a plan, but the plan is really what's the next job. And I think it's important to, in my case, to be opportunistic. You can't tell the future. You may decide that there's something that you'd like to do differently if the opportunity came. So I think it's important to be able to recognize opportunities and then seize them. Finding mentors. I mean, it's terrific to have people help you along the way, on all aspects of the career. And I have a one secret about mentors, and that secret is they don't have to know that they are your mentor. They don't have to know it. They may know it. You can choose them. They don't have to choose you. Spend time with them, pick their brain, or just observe their behavior, and you'll learn. And the last is I think about career building is really the most important point, which is to develop self-knowledge, knowledge of yourself, what you want, what you don't want, what you like, what you don't like, what you want in a work environment, what you expect out of a job, and what do you expect out of the rest of your life, and how does that fit in, and what's the relationship? If you really want to fish for trout every weekend, you're going to have to make some compromises with respect to where you work, perhaps. So another tip is don't think of this pathway through a career as being one where it's just a set of it's a one-way staircase. You may decide that there's a reason why you want to take a step back. You may want to take a job that you think has better long-term possibilities or more interest that's somewhere else where you have less responsibility, maybe less compensation. And I think it's important to do that. And as you grow older, you realize you're in the best position to take risks like that when you're young than you are when you're older and you've picked up lots of responsibilities. Well, coming from TRB, I have to say a word about professional organizations. And I think the why should you be involved in professional organizations? And of course, there's lots of professional organizations, and I'm not advocating TRB in particular. There's Institute of Transportation Engineers, there's IEEE, ASCE, the other professional societies, there's the Women's Transportation Seminar, and so on. ITS usually has state chapters. It's a great place to, of course, develop technical skills, a great place for networking. Networking is usually cited as the #1 reason why people go to TRB. It's a great place to work on those communication and skills that I mentioned earlier, to take on responsibility that leads to greater leadership. How do you go about doing this? Well, when I was a young consultant, I was really naive. I thought that if I wrote good papers and submitted them to TRB and they were presented and published, someone would come and tap me on the shoulder and say, "Good boy, Bob, we want you to join a committee." Well, it doesn't work like that. The way you join committees, and I think this is true with most of these professional organizations, is you go to those committee meetings if you can. You hang around with those committees. If there's an opportunity to do something where you can volunteer, do it. It doesn't matter whether you're a committee member or not. Do it. And that's the way, committees are populated by the people who show up. And showing up is not just adding their name to their resume and making 1 out of 2 meetings. showing up is doing and helping do the work of the committees. It's, well, where do you do this? Well, depending on where you go to work, getting support to go to national meetings is sometimes tough. It's expensive, travel, room. So you may or may not have those opportunities available. If you don't have them available, then you need to think about the local opportunities, because a number of these organizations have local chapters. And so you should, consider doing that. There are outlets, and I would definitely explore them. Now, the end is at hand. Leadership. This is, Yenhai mentioned it again. He's mentioned leadership a number of times when he talked to me about this. And I may feel a little uncomfortable talking about communication skills, but leadership is really tough. But early on in my career, not early on, but in the middle of my career, I mentioned I oversaw the policy study work at TRV. And so we had a number of studies going on. They would last 18 months, 2 years. They would have an expert committee. We would have a staff officer working on each study. But in general, I went to all the committee meetings. And so I watched a large number of individuals participate in these committees, including Joe Mahoney back there. But I paid particular attention to the chairs. I mean, so this is leadership, not in terms of being president of the country. This is leadership in terms of a committee process. It's got a tough job to do, and very bright people, but people that often come from different backgrounds depending on what the subject matter is. Well, first, to be a good leader, they generally are people who do their job well. Whatever it is they do, whatever their day job is, they do that job well. Otherwise, they're not going to get noticed. Be a leader. They're usually very respectful of others and their views. It's hard to be a leader, at least in the environments that I've worked, if you lose the respect of the people who are on the committee. They weigh their own comments carefully. And this is whether you're a committee member or a chair, weigh them carefully, but don't be shy. So you're not effective if you don't speak up, but think about what you say before you say it. Good leaders, again, particularly in this context I described, have great synthesizing skills. They're able to say, after a contentious discussion, they're able to say, well, here's what we've heard. There's this view, and here's where the key points of disagreements are. They generally can offer a vision about where, whatever that is, whether it's a group or a firm or a company, where they should be headed. They don't necessarily have to be visionary in that sense, but they do have to offer a vision about how we're moving forward. And when times get tough, and times get tough in almost any organization at some time, they're able to provide order and clarity and a possible direction out, a way out. And that's what we expect of leaders. But it all starts, back up at the top. Do your job well, be careful about what you say, but once you got something to say it. Be respectful of others. And so that's my wisdom about leadership. And that's my disjointed set of lessons to take away this evening. And I hope this has in some way been helpful. Certainly, I've had a great day here at the University of Washington. Campus is beautiful, and I'm sure that you all are. It's a pleasure to study on such a beautiful campus. So I'm done. If we have questions, I'll be happy to answer the questions. And what's the plan, Yanai?
So we have some time for questions. So thanks a lot. I think it's a very interesting talk. Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, thinking before speaking up.
I have a question, Bob. Actually, in civil engineering, we train students how to be a great engineer. We normally don't offer any classes about how to develop a good presentation or how to be a great leader. So through your career, did you take any classes on building your leadership, or what you learned from your career about these young person when they grown up? What are the things they should look into so they can be a great leader in the future?
Yeah, well, I think a certain degree of luck and serendipity is. On communication skills, I never had any training after high school. And I was just lucky I had a couple of good English teachers in high school, because otherwise no one would have helped me learn how to write, certainly not in engineering school. And speaking, what helped me, and this is certainly true in this area, that is this geographic area and the companies that are here. When I was a transportation consultant, it was still in the early days of transportation planning. There was a lot of money to be spent. I did a lot of work in public transportation planning. There was a huge amount of money to help privately owned transit properties transition to public ownership and operation. And so there was so much work to do that within a couple years of starting a consulting career, I was managing projects and forced to go and meet, clients and give presentations on my own. And so, but even then, you would think that the consulting firm would have an interest in teaching you. But it was, either, toss you into the water and see if you can swim. And so that was my experience, and I'd like to believe that schools are doing a better job on communication skills now than they once were. I'd like to believe they're doing a better job on the history, but I think some of it is just being your own best, harshest critic, and trying to improve yourself. So that's why I think these style guides that I mentioned, it'll take you 10 minutes to look at them. And I'll tell you, since I'm so comfortable, and since you're so relaxed, and you don't seem, when we have plenty of time, I met a fellow. He's passed away, but he was a member of the National Academy of Engineering, very successful researcher at IBM, and another close friend who introduced me said she thought he was a bit autistic because he didn't have very good social skills. But he was very successful financially. He went on to an academic career, and he got interested in Frank Lloyd Wright. And he bought a large Frank Lloyd Wright house and restored it in the Chicago area. And then he decided to write a book about it. So he wrote a book about Frank Lloyd Wright and his buildings, and he self-published it. And he was explaining this to me, and I self-published it. And he said he gave it to another friend, a friend of a friend, to look at, and she was an editor. And she just took a pen to the first 3 pages of his book and marked up the grammatical mistakes, the structural mistakes. And he said, Bob, I looked at that and I could see exactly what she was doing, and I went home and I completely edited it myself that night. Well, he was probably 75 years old at this stage, so I'd like you to believe that you don't have to wait till you're 75 to realize that other people can help you learn how to develop these kind of skills. Okay. All right, so, so I'm getting all the the older crowd. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, we were talking earlier about whether you wanted to, I've got a booming voice anyway, so whether you were interested in teaching, okay? And so that last slide on leadership and you sort of brought it up yourself.
In transportation all throughout the university. Some of whom you know about, some of whom you don't. So some of that experience is right homegrown. Going to some of these local professional meetings, society, another way to start. One of the groups that I really like is the Women's Transportation Seminar, because they attract women from a very broad definition of transportation. So